Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started here. So welcome, and thank you for the turnout. My name is Bob Seidenschwartz. I recognize some of you from the previous evening. So current President, Montana World Affairs Council, ex-President, World Affairs Council, now President Emeritus, which I realize they give you when you get older. So I have to accept certain realities. And we only have a precious hour to talk about a large country with a massive footprint today and well into the future in terms of global issues, relationships, trade. So we're going to get started right away here. On my left is Dexter Tiff Roberts. His father, Dexter Roberts, is a bit of a legend here at the University of Montana. And Dexter recently moved back from China, where he spent 20 years as a bureau chief for Business Week in Bloomberg. So I'm just going to let him just give a little bit of his background in terms of how did he get to that point where he winds up in China in such a prestigious position. So Dexter, if you would share a little bit of your educational background and kind of that history of how you came to this point, and then we're going to get right into it. So we started 5 minutes later, so we'll make sure we'll get the full hour. All right, Dexter?
Thanks very much, Bob. I should warn you in advance, I've been losing my voice, so I'm hoping this microphone solves all my sound problems. But I may squeak and make weird sounds or sound like I've been a big smoker my whole life. I don't smoke, but
you did live in China. So you did
I did live in China.
Yes.
I lived in China, yes,
yeah.
Which could do that. Apparently it's a couple pack a day habit to live in China these days where I was. So yeah, I'm from Missoula. I was born here and graduated from high school here. And I am actually asked occasionally, more than occasionally, how I ended up in China. Actually, you just brought up my father. My father was very interested in Eastern religions. Gave me a book on Chinese philosophy right around high school, and I ended up becoming quite interested, and then studying Mandarin Chinese when I went to college, which was down at Stanford in California. I should say at that time, studying Chinese was considered a little bit of a risky decision. My advisor at the time told me that I was making a great mistake because this was. Give you an idea of how old I am. This was in the 80s, and back then we were all told that Japan was going to take over the world. So my advisor said, if you want to be practical and you're really interested in Asia, you need to study Japanese. But I like to pretend I was very, I saw far into the future and realized that China would become what it is today, the world's second largest economy, on track perhaps to become the world's largest economy in the next 10 years. But I had no idea. I just was being stubborn. So I was interested in China. I was interested in the 20th century history with the communist revolution there. And I was interested in Chinese philosophy as well. So that's how I ended up. I was Chinese at Stanford, Chinese after college in Taiwan for a while. And then, as Bob, you already mentioned, actually 23 years working as a reporter for Bloomberg Business Week in Beijing. And I just came back in last summer, so recently.
So welcome back, and a great resource for us to have here in the community. I'm going to ask Tiff to kind of also give a little bit of quickly, just so that you have a sense of the size of China, its population, and the opportunity for him to share these insights. I mean, if you understand what it means to be the bureau chief for Bloomberg Business Week, this means you have your finger on the pulse, culturally and economically, and he gets access and insights into situations that you're not going to hear about typically in the news. So it's a rare opportunity for us to have this discussion with him. So now you're in China. You've had this 20-year experience. I'm going to ask you right out of the gate here, 2019 is kind of a critical year for China and its leadership. So please explain to us kind of that backdrop of what's happening and why so.
Yeah, 2019 is actually a year of sensitive anniversaries for China, and China's had the same people in charge, the same party in charge, the Communist Party of China, since 1949. So you can imagine if you have the same people in charge with actually very little accountability for now 70 years. One of those anniversaries this year is October 1st, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. You get some baggage. So the first anniversary, October 1st, 1949, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the country, the People's Republic of China. The government is very intent on making sure that anniversary happens without any hiccups, without any protests, and typically important anniversaries like that have been used by by dissident folks that may not be happy with how things have gone. So that's one anniversary. Much more immediate, we have next month, May 4th, the 100th anniversary of the what's called the May 4th movement, which 1919, you have students start protesting. This sounds familiar, maybe before I talk about the next anniversary. So you have students protesting, not just in Beijing, but in Shanghai and cities around the country. They're very upset with the then leadership, which of course is it's the leadership before the one we have now. And they're upset specifically about the outcome of the war, World War I, and the decision by basically the Versailles Treaty, the decision by the government to hand over some of the areas of China that had been under, basically they were shuffling around the colonies. China was colonized to a degree along the coast then, and rather than hand back everything to China, parts of it was going to be given to some of the other victors in the war. And then there was a real push to try to, actually way back then, bring democracy to the country. So they had a slogan, Mr. Democracy, Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. They wanted to modernize the government. They wanted to modernize the whole country, and students were at the forefront of this. Mao later was to cite the May 4th movement as crucial to the founding of the Communist Party, which happened 2 years later in 1921. So next month, May 4th, we're going to have an anniversary which was all about students and workers in China protesting against what they thought was poor leadership by the government. So this is very sensitive for the government today. There's a lot of people that are worried or view some of the policy decisions of the leadership as incorrect. Finally, the one that you probably I would hope some of you or most of you have heard about, the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. So that happens June 4th. And that, if you don't know, that's when hundreds, if not thousands, of students and workers were actually killed by China's own forces when they also protested for democracy and a bunch of other issues as well. So what we can expect throughout this year, we have 3 sensitive anniversaries coming up. What that always means is a clampdown on security in sensitive parts of the country. The most sensitive place probably is Tiananmen Square, at the traditional seat of power in China. And so we will see a much heavier security. Typically, you can't even enter the square. I was previous years, even that were not as sensitive as this one, but an anniversary of, for example, of June 4th every year, you can't enter the square without showing an ID, a passport. If you're a foreigner, to the police, you get frisked. There's metal detectors. They might do a little facial recognition on you now, and then they let you into the square. So anyway, the backdrop is a very sensitive year for China and for the party that rules China.
So as we kind of look at today and look at the challenges that China faces, there's something that you said several times that I want just briefly for you to touch on, because it is very important. If you go back to where China was basically colonized, controlled by foreign powers, fast forward, please give a brief description of what did China even look like 30, 40 years ago? And that's part of this nationalistic feeling that is so strongly embedded in the Chinese people that I'm going to ask you to say, 40 years ago, where's the Chinese economy? Where was the majority of the population? Were they still living in poverty? Because this is so much of a driver in terms of the national pride that is so embedded in China today.
Yeah, well, last year, 2018, obviously, was the 40th anniversary of what they call Reform and Opening, which was in 1978. And so 40 years ago, China was a radically different place. They had just emerged just a couple years out of the Cultural Revolution, which was this violent movement that sort of tore society and government apart over the period of almost a decade. Mao had just died in 1976, and some far-sighted leaders, particularly Deng Xiaoping, came forward, who was then the he was the president and the party secretary. Or, I'm sorry, the president. He came forward and decided to open up the economy. 1978, it was radically different. It was far from being the second largest economy in the world. When I arrived I moved to Beijing in 1995. It was just maybe had just broken into the top 10 largest economies by GDP in the world.
But massive poverty was still, 30, 40 years ago, was still a significant issue throughout the country, which was at that time predominantly rural versus urban, which is another component that's changed very radically too, which is China now, I believe, is getting close to a balance, or maybe is starting to become more urban than rural, which is another part of the advancement of its economy.
That's, yeah, I mean, poverty. They now say 13 million people in extreme poverty left, and they're planning. This is one of the signature policies of the present leader, Xi Jinping, to eradicate absolute poverty, and he's planning to do that, I think, by 2020.
So I only bring this up because I don't know if we understand how fast and how far they've come in such a short period of time to be at this point, as opposed to simply where they were. So if we look at that, we fast forward to the present, what are some of the challenges then that they are facing right now in 2019, especially with some of these sensitive anniversaries? We're dealing with tariffs, a trade war potentially here with the U.S. and China. So, give us some of the issues that you see are big challenges right now.
Right. So, as we discussed already, the economy is now the world's second largest. It's on track. A lot of people think we won't see it, and we won't know for sure until it happens, to become larger than the U.S. in terms of GDP. Just 2 days ago, they announced the growth figures for the economy for the first quarter of this year, and it grew 6.4%, which they seem quite, at least on the surface, quite pleased with, and you can't really blame them. 6.4%, those are numbers that we would love to have.
Yeah.
I think we're 2+% here in the U.S. But it's interesting. China, you need to sort of dig a little deeper and look at those numbers. And the reality is 6.4% for the first quarter has a lot of people concerned in China. You've got to first of all consider sort of put it in the context of China. China's last year grew 6.6%. 2018, it grew 6.6%, a little bit faster than the first quarter of this year. That was the slowest growth in 30 years.
I've been growing on an average of about 10%.
Yeah, that was that, at least according to the official figures, was the slowest growth in 30 years. It's continuing to slow. They're predicting. I mean, the analysts are saying maybe 6.3% growth for the year. And they need rapid growth. We're talking about 1.4 billion people, a working age population that is close to 1 billion people, so they need rapid growth. The other thing to consider is look at where's that growth coming from, and it's pretty clear where it's coming from if you look. And basically, it's a very, very loose credit policy. So. Huge amount of bank loans from, by the way, the banks are all state-owned, so it's all state money. A massive new local infrastructure bond program, which is supposed to spur more bridges and dams and so on. They put a lot of money in the last 10 years into infrastructure. They want to put more in. If you look at another number that's worth looking at when you look at the first quarter, steel production in China, I think it grew 221 million tons in the first quarter. That's the most steel that China's ever produced in first quarter of the year, ever. And you put this in the context of the fact that they have been saying repeatedly over recent years that they want to cut steel production because they produce too much steel of low quality that wastes lots of energy, that's terribly polluting. So it makes people sound like me if they spent too much time in China because the pollution's so bad. Right. So there's been a national priority to try to cut steel production. Why is steel production up as dramatically as it is in the first quarter of this year? Because that's one way they can guarantee economic growth. Tell these steel companies to produce more.
My insight is, the question I would ask you is, this incredible demand and need to keep economic growth sustainable, even at the expense of producing inferior products, flooding the market. That's one of the issues we have, is that China has flooded the market, particularly with steel, because they so heavily subsidize their industries. But I think there's something important that you need to explain to our audience about, from a governmental standpoint and from a stability standpoint. They're not always making good economic decisions, but they're doing it for a very specific reason. What would that be?
Well, I think probably as much as any other reason, they're trying to create jobs, and they say that they'll say that themselves. Every year when they put out targets still, which is about how fast they're going to grow and everything, how much steel they're going to produce, which is a legacy of the state plan system of the past. And one of the key numbers they put out is how many jobs they're going to create, how many urban jobs. I think this year is in line with previous years. They've said that they will and they must create 11 million new urban jobs. And so they need to. So jobs is a very, very big one for them in terms of motivating this desire for very rapid economic growth. The other big issue, frankly, is decreasing productivity in the economy. They've put so much money into the economy, put so much loans, bonds. They've built up a very, very large debt to GDP ratio, which, depending on who you talk to, is near or over 300% of the economy. And that, which by the way is considered in many places potentially dangerously destabilizing. Although every country, you have to look at the specifics before you decide whether it is going to be destabilizing. So they're accepting all these things. I think they're now this first quarter, they're going to have a lot more pollution back in the cities. They'd made progress in reducing that in previous years because of the steel surge. Because I think they want to create more jobs.
Right. And that is such a critical part for China: political stability, economic growth, and that's. It's hard to, again, think about 1.4 billion people, but the need to provide jobs and a future is paramount in terms of the governmental action. At the same time, there's consequences to that, and I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on, when you've got this much leverage in your economy and the rest of the world has very substantial amounts of leverage into their economies, you pull a little pin out of the middle. And it seems to me that would be a real concern for China, is that they can't afford to have the rest of the world also slowing down, because they still are a significant exporter of their goods and services, correct?
Yes, yeah. And actually export figures were quite positive in March, which they were very pleased about, because they had not looked very good at all earlier in the year, particularly with the Chinese New Year, the big festival, and Lunar New Year happening in February, which is when the country sort of slows down. So there had been a pretty significant slowdown in exports, which it looks now was to a degree related to the seasonal issue with the Lunar New Year. So they still do rely on exports. They rely a lot on big multinational companies, many of them U.S. companies that have invested lots of money into China, have major manufacturing facilities, which a lot of people probably are aware of, hire lots of Chinese people, which is important, and bring new technology and new management know-how and capital investment into the Chinese economy.
So you're talking about U.S. businesses, European companies, but we have an issue with that, don't we, in terms of intellectual property, in some cases outright theft. The demands for doing business under certain conditions if you want to do business in China. Give us a little insight as to what some of the concerns are of businesses that want to be in China but are really running up against some pretty significant barriers.
There's really been the same issues that I first heard about when I arrived in the mid-90s in China, but on a much larger scale now, which is the big one is intellectual property rights. There's as you say, part of it is baked into the agreements that foreign companies make, where they are required to provide access to their intellectual property, their technology, usually they're required to be in a joint venture with a Chinese partner, and that intellectual property has to be available often to the Chinese partner in order, sort of as terms of the deal, before they even come. So that's one. The other one is just outright theft, which is there's a whole bunch of issues there. There's requirements that Chinese ministries have about reporting technology when you use it in China, that there's been a fear that there's been leakage from these ministries, where foreign companies will dutifully report what they have and file it, and then somehow that information ends up in the hands of a rival Chinese company. So the real big issues are the same as they've always been: intellectual property rights and technology transfer, whether it's forced or not. And those continue to be huge issues. What's changed, I think, is companies were really, really cautious about talking openly about their concerns in the past, particularly to a journalist like myself, or they would talk off the record, and then they would expect their business associations, like there's an American Chamber of Commerce that's very active, branch that's very active in China, and they were the ones who were supposed to go forward and say, American companies are very upset about intellectual property theft, but the companies themselves were much less willing to talk. That's really changed. The American Chamber just put out a report where they said the days of American companies in the American Chamber being a voice for for a better and stronger relationship are they didn't quite put it that way, but basically they said we can't be there, sort of standing there on China's side saying, okay, there's a misunderstanding between the U.S. and China. We understand also the Chinese perspective. Let's play a good guy moderator role.
We want a more level playing field, and I understand also the EU has also, which I had not heard this over the last several years, but there have now been some pretty straightforward comments coming from some of the EU trading partners as well with China on the very same issues.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the companies you don't hear from as much are the ones that are really, really beholden or dependent on the China market. Apple, GM, these companies, their largest, they're certainly their fastest growing markets and very important markets. China is now one of their most important markets. So they, GM's case is their largest market. It's bigger than the U.S. market. So those companies are still, they're upset, but they're a little bit less willing to talk. But you're hearing from other organizations, business organizations and companies now. Like
so you mentioned Apple. I know a lot of us have Apple phones. At the current time, could Apple afford to move its operations out of China back to the U.S.? Would they have enough engineers? Would they have enough workers? Could they do it at a cost level that makes it profitable? Would that be a problem for Apple if they said, no, we're out of here? Or are they, in effect, kind of beholden to the situation because of the cost structure?
They are certainly the cost structure in this vast ecosystem of supply companies, which has grown up around Apple in China. That all makes it difficult for them to just sort of uproot and go somewhere else. They can't take all the supply chain of 500 smaller Chinese or wherever they might be from, Taiwanese, Hong Kong companies with them very easily. The other issue, of course, is if you're selling into the China market, it's convenient to be producing next to, in the China market. Having said that, Foxconn, which is Apple's largest supplier, largest manufacturer in the world, just announced that they're going to start not producing in the U.S., although they've been talking about Wisconsin, and that hasn't really panned out, and it wasn't for the iPhone anyway. But anyway, they're talking about India now. So they are, and it's official. They're going to start producing the iPhone in India. So there are other options. Actually, this is a big issue in China right now. There's a lot of the supply chain is slowly moving out mainly because of much higher costs in China. Wages, believe it or not, they've doubled. I think average manufacturing wages have doubled in the last 10 years. So you've got a lot of far more affordable countries right next door: Vietnam, Indonesia, India. There's lots of issues there. It's not easy to move the supply chain, but it is starting to slowly happen. But not to your question now. I mean, they're not to the U.S. They're not coming back here.
Right. The cost structure still doesn't make it in Apple's interest. So let's talk a little bit about China, the factory of the world. But China's trying to transition. They're trying to uplift, and to your point about the cost structure going to other places, they want to be now not just a borrower of technology, but they want to be a technology innovator. They want to produce a higher degree of products and services. One, they've got a burgeoning middle class, but they also want to be competitive with the Europeans and the U.S. companies. So talk a little bit about those challenges, and I'm also going to ask you to describe the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a significant portion of their domestic and global policy.
So the push to, first of all, the push to move up sort of the technology value-added chain is something they've been trying for a number of years. The latest permutation of that they call Made in China 2025. Became very controversial after Trump and other people in the Trump administration singled it out as a glaring example of industrial policy, which it is. So they've been trying to do this for a while. And by the way, I mentioned the vast working age population, which is it's huge, almost 1 billion. And they've got I think people working now is around 700 million. So far larger than the population of the U.S., of course. But they also have 250 million people over 60 that are retired, which is nearing a fifth of the population. By 2030, a quarter of the population will be over 60. So they have, actually for the first time, a shrinking workforce. That's one of the main reasons wages have been going up. So the old model made factory of the world for China was based on a lot of things, but the crucial element was low-cost workers. And China is really losing that edge. And as I said, the salaries are significantly lower, not just in Vietnam and India, but Malaysia. I mean, places that are pretty well developed have actually cheaper workforces now. So the policy to move up the value-added chain is in part a recognition of a reality that they can't avoid, which is they can't make margins with the wages they have to pay workers. Everything's going up. Cost of land's going up. Cost of energy is going up. They actually can't really be factory of the world anymore and make any money. So on top of that, there's been a long time ambitious goal to sort of restore China's national pride by becoming not a factory of the world, but instead producer of high-end technology that can compete globally, and not just in China, but go out and take over markets in the other parts of the world. And it's a very systemized policy with a lot of money behind it. They're putting billions of dollars into it, both from the central government, and different local governments will all have their own little mini versions of Made in China policy. They've singled out 10 major industries which are the biggest beneficiaries of the subsidies and low-cost loans, which include robotics, which they're also trying to automate the factories as they don't have as many workers, aerospace, sort of what you would guess, new energy vehicles, biomedicine, and a bunch of others. And by the way, I was just going to say they've recently backed away from publicly talking about this policy, simply because every time they did, someone in the Trump administration would say, "Ha-ha, you still have an industrial policy. You're not playing fair. You're giving subsidies to these industries." And so they just stopped talking about it. But the idea that they've somehow abandoned this long-time goal to become a global technological power is absurd. And of course they want to. And why wouldn't they? Of course they want to become a global technological power. Of course they want to have companies that are as good or better than companies in the U.S. and elsewhere.
Hey, they want to be competitive.
Yeah.
It's no different than any other economy that needs to provide jobs, security, and opportunity for its people. I'm kind of keeping track of the time here because we've got an hour to cover such a vast subject, and you touch on a lot of issues. So I'm going to ask you to talk briefly about, so just people understand what the Belt and Road Initiative is. And also, China faces, because of the demographic issues, massive problems with providing health care. And also on the environment, too, because we hear about China still building coal-fired plants. There's hardly a river or a lake that isn't polluted in the country. And these pollution issues relate directly to many of the health care issues. So I'm throwing a couple of things at you. So start with Belt and Road, move to the health care, and then China's concern and what they're trying to do about their environmental issues.
Right.
All within 2 minutes.
So they call One Belt and One Road, or Belt and Road, is this very ambitious policy, again, very much associated with Xi Jinping, now leader for life, after he abolished term limits for the presidency last year. And so he's, at home he's got the battle against poverty, which is needed, I think. Overseas he's got a One Belt, what he calls the One Belt, One Road policy. The idea is sort of a Marshall Plan, if you will, for China. And so the idea is they're going to, and they are, spend, according to some estimates, $1.3 trillion. Now those figures have been widely discussed, and there's a lot of disagreement how much of it is repackaging deals they've already done and how much of it is new deals. They actually recently had a crackdown on companies advertising themselves as doing Belt and Road projects, because everybody's jumped on the bandwagon and said, I'm doing Belt and Road. I got this, I got this coal-fired powered plant in Kazakhstan, and it's Belt and Road. And I got this bridge in
and they're in the Middle
Malaysia,
East, and they're in Africa, and
Yeah.
they're building these massive projects. But there's some issues with this, too, that are concerning from a strategic standpoint and from an economic standpoint with the U.S., and I would even say with some of the Europeans. What are some of your insights about this very aggressive push into these other areas, which historically have not been a part of what they have had?
Well, there's certainly a geopolitical element to it. So they very clearly see it as a combining economics and economic development overseas, and a larger role for China geopolitically as well. And they've made a big push into Central Asia, which is could be arguably be up for grabs in terms of up for grabs. But in any case, it's a very sensitive part of the world, obviously, and so they've gone into areas that often where the U.S. has been downgrading its presence, spending less money. They're big in Africa. They've started trying to go into Europe. The latest country that has become a concern of some U.S. officials is for its relationship with Belt and Road is Italy. Italy has been making a big, sort of throwing open its doors and saying, we welcome all Chinese investment. We're the first Western European country to be part of the Belt and Road. You have voices, people in Italy, including in the government, who are very concerned, who say it's a mistake, that they're not doing due diligence on the projects that are coming in.
Right.
And so the other thing I should mention is there's been a bit of a backlash recently, including in countries that initially seemed to be very much bought into the idea that this was a good for all, win-win with China coming in. So, for example, Malaysia, with Mahathir back in charge, the leader, prime minister, pushed back very hard and pushed to renegotiate a lot of the terms of deals that had been done. The Maldives just kicked out the leader that was extremely pro-China, and one of the main reasons he lost the election was he was perceived as too pro-China, that he had allowed too much Chinese companies coming in without doing enough due diligence on what the terms were. The other thing that I mentioned, that they talk about debt trap diplomacy. So this fear that these countries, including Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and others, are getting caught into deep debt traps because they owe China so much money.
Well, we see that right here in the Western Hemisphere with Venezuela.
Yes.
They've been trading oil for capital for what they needed to run the country, and of course we know the story now that pretty much it's run into the ground. But my apologies, because I wanted to ask you also to talk about some of the environmental issues that China is facing right now, and that is directly related to just an elderly population, so you're going to have more healthcare issues. But please give us some insight as far as that type of challenge to China as well.
Well, first for a connection to One Belt, One Road, China's pretty aggressively pushed to try to improve as much as you can coal technology in China. They've also tried to, they've pushed non-fossil fuel energy, a very big push on nuclear, but also hydrology, also wind, also solar. At the same time, with One Belt, One Road, they've been sort of offloading a lot of their old polluting technology.
Right.
So you've got, if you look at the sort of the carbon cosmic sheet for China, it's a little bit mixed. They've made great improvements at home, which they care about, and they should. They want a healthier environment for their own people, but they've been, in many cases, selling this old technology, and they built a whole bunch of really dirty carbon coal factories, plants across, power plants, across in Pakistan. Pakistan has been a big recipient of that, but also in Central Asia. So that's overseas.
So the lesson for me is, don't take at first blush what appears to be a positive until you look to see where the interconnectivity of where this is all going, because it's been said even if the U.S. stopped using coal today, the amount of coal production that is growing in other parts of the world would absolutely offset any of the benefits of us stopping to use coal. Not that we shouldn't do it for economic or environmental reasons, but you have to know these insights. You have to understand how this is happening, and it's all based around the fact that they need to continue to have economic growth.
Yeah. I mean, the positive things in China on that front is the flourishing new energy vehicle market, which is growing rapidly, and they're putting huge amounts of subsidies into that, which from the U.S. administration would probably say that's wrong, but they're at the same time they're moving rapidly towards a much cleaner, better auto fleet. Traditional auto sales in China actually fell last year, not non-new energy vehicles, fossil fuel engines, for the first time in 30 years. First time since they've had a private car market, it actually fell. So for a lot of reasons, but one of them was the fact that there's this growing popularity of new energy vehicles.
But the trajectory of car usage in either traditional or electric is still continuing to rise, and will probably rise for quite some time.
Yeah, if you look at per capita
Right.
car ownership,
Right.
it's a fraction of what we have here in the U.S.
So my head is spinning. I realize that I need to ask you a lot more questions, but I also have to be respectful of the fact that I know you probably have a lot of questions as well. So at this time, I'm just going to ask us to open this up for your questions, and please, you've got the expert here, folks. Take advantage of it. So if you do have a question, there's a mic right there in the middle. If you would go to that, or if you've got a big booming voice, then by all means. So questions, please.
I have three questions. One is, you say they don't make great steel, that it's substandard steel, but they make a lot of it. What do they use it for, and who do they sell it to? Second, what are the chances are, with their growing navy and more aggressive posture, that they might invade Taiwan? And third, the Tibetan Plateau and northwest China, what do they use that for in their economic push?
Okay, three great questions. Thank you.
So I maybe spoke too, maybe I did without enough, I didn't qualify enough. They're making better and better steel, which is a problem for American steel companies. But they do make a lot of very low standard steel. And to answer your question, so part of it they don't really use it. They have excess capacity, but they use it to employ steel workers and pay local tax revenues from the steel companies, and it's a mess how that all works out. But some of it's not used. Some of it's used. It's like rebar, so for construction. So a lot of it's used for construction, low quality steel. So that's steel. They are making better steel, but a lot of it is lower quality that they don't want to make anymore. Taiwan, yeah, I mean, I think it's the way things are going, it's inevitable. I think that they will that there's a real possibility that there would be an invasion of Taiwan or a blockade or something militarily aggressive. And I say this from someone who started my China career in Taipei, and I love the Taiwanese, Taiwan people. I lived there for 4 years, so it's a very alarming to me. But if you look at where both places, you're not allowed to say both countries, of course, if you're in China. Multinationals are constantly being punished for suggesting that Taiwan, God forbid, is a country, because China doesn't accept that. It's a renegade province, or it's a territory that they didn't quite tie up the loose ends and get back after World War II. But if you look at the leadership in Taiwan, and you look at the leadership, particularly Xi Jinping and the Communist Party in China, and the degree to which in China these nationalistic values about sort of making China great again are increasingly being used to sort of create social cohesion in China, which I think will probably only become stronger as the economy continues to slow, which it will continue to slow. I think there's a real possibility of conflict.
Do we not have a military agreement to come to Taiwan's aid?
Right.
If China does cross over that tripwire, and from your perspective, will we do so? Because that's one of the great fears I think that people have, is that some believe military confrontation between the U.S. and China is inevitable, whether it's in the South China Sea or over Taiwan. So first, accurate that we do have a treaty. Secondly, is it something that we would enforce from your viewpoint?
Right. Yeah, we have the Taiwan Relations Act, which says that we will come to their aid, so it's an act of Congress, and according to that, we're obligated to come to their aid. And I think until recently, it seemed fairly clear that we would, but with the present leadership in the United States, I think it's unclear whether we would or not. I don't think Trump has been all over the place on Taiwan and China. One day he took a call from the Taiwanese president after he won the election, before January when he took office, which shocked everybody, because the next U.S. president is not supposed to speak to the Taiwanese president. And so that was heralded in Taiwan as the beginning of a new era, where the U.S. would break the old norms and actually treat Taiwan more like sort of the international place that it is. But then, he's also best friends with Xi Jinping, and he seems to be motivated often more frankly, by his ego and how his ego's feeling that week. So I really don't know the answer to that. I think there's more uncertainty about that question, whether the U.S. would actually come to the aid of China in the event of military hostilities with China, the aid of Taiwan in the event of military hostilities with China, than there ever has been before.
Which goes right to the heart of then why a treaty, why an agreement, if you're not going to honor it. And this is one of the things that I'm sure that is a constant within just policy, especially coming from the U.S., where we're being watched as to the seriousness of agreements that you make. So do you think China possibly, or within China's military complex, there are those who wish to test the boundaries of U.S. seriousness when you look at the South China Seas or you look at Taiwan?
I think there are. I think they probably view the today and into the future as sort of the dawn of a new era, where they can sort of the rules are a lot less clear when it comes to geopolitics.
Right.
And China's military, of course, becomes stronger and stronger, and they become with One Belt and One Road and other measures around the world, they're becoming more influential. So of course they would want to test the old rules.
Right.
And they're doing that in the South China Sea. And of course that didn't start under the that didn't start under the Trump administration. It started really in earnest under Obama. And there's people that follow that feel feel that mistakes were made then as well in terms of not responding earlier to Chinese buildup in the South China Sea. But yeah, I think there's I haven't spoken to them about this, but I do think in the Chinese Army military brass, which is the People's Liberation Army, every day there's more and more that's sort of questioning how far can we push this,
Right.
and let's find out. And they're doing it in the South China Sea in particular.
And I want to ask you more about that, but do we have some questions?
It seems as if I heard that Russia or Putin was going to go to China, and I don't know that I've heard of what's happened since. So could you discuss the Russia-China relationship a little bit?
So Xi Jinping and Putin have had a number of meetings, and recently the consensus has been is that the relationship is getting closer, and it seems to be, the obvious, a geostrategic decision on both the part of China and Russia, as they face more opposition internationally, particularly from the United States. Makes sense for them to get closer to each other. The Russian-China relationship is very complicated. It goes way back. They've had they've had reunions and breakups repeatedly, and very dramatic ones. So they were in the early years of China's development under the People's Republic. So after 1949, they were very close, and Mao listened very closely to instructions from Stalin, and as a result, China had a huge aid package from Russia, from the then Soviet Union, and you had tens of thousands of Russian engineers in China building all the major. There's a whole series of interesting, I don't know if beautiful is the right word, historically interesting architecture in China that's all Russian. So the Great Hall of the People in Tiananmen Square, the Grand Exhibition Hall. There's all these very Stalin-esque buildings around Chinese cities today, and that was all built with Russian blueprints and Russian engineers. So, but then there was a very large split. Russia pulled out. I won't get into all the details, but they pulled out everybody, and China felt like they'd been badly betrayed by the Soviet Union, and so they don't really trust each other, I think. But I think it's good. I think the relationship, for the geopolitical reasons
At the moment, they have a common
closer.
foe.
Yeah,
which is us.
Yeah.
I'll take a question from Mayor Dad, and then yours, please.
What's the staying power of the Communist Party in China with state-sponsored capitalism and a dictator for life or a president for life? How much influence do they have or expect to have in the future?
Well, I mean, their goal, of course, is to have all the influence in their hands for all future, right? So, I mean, they're one of the biggest motivating factors in policy in China is ensuring that the Communist Party continues, as it has since 1949, to be the sole ruling party of China. And so, it's a vast party that extends deep into the country. Some 80 million members, the world's largest party, I think, still it would be, and certainly the world's largest communist party, and the world's longest existent, communist party as well. So I mean, they've got, every little village has its own party chief. Every company, pretty much every company, not every company, but all the state-owned companies and increasingly the private companies have little party cells within them that are supposed to be involved in the decision-making. And this effort to sort of extend the reach of the party, not just in politics, but in economics and in society, has been much increased and much more emphasized under Xi Jinping. So there's been a whole push to bring the party back into universities, for example. So the party, there's always been a party groups within the universities, and they've always been powerful. They're supposed to become much more powerful now. As I mentioned just a second ago, private companies, there's been a big push for Chinese private companies, if they don't have them yet, they're supposed to set up a private party arm. The joint ventures with foreign companies, the American companies, they've been increasingly told you have to have a branch of the party in your company. So, but how long the party will last, it's anyone's guess how long that would be. I think the desire for them to ensure that they are in charge becomes only stronger as things become more difficult within the country. So their efforts become stronger too.
Mirdad?
It's two questions in one, basically. First and foremost, clearly, one region which has been a major concern for the central government has been Xinjiang. And at one point, it had a Muslim majority population, Uyghurs or Uyghurs, lost its name, Eastern Turkestan, to Xinjiang. So it has been more or less a form of Chinese colonization of an indigenous people. Tiff, I would like you to comment on it. What is the policy of China in its western, northwestern region? But also if you could connect that then, because you have made references to this, in terms of China's policy vis-a-vis Central Asia, the 5 former Soviet republics. And it seems pipelines are being built as we speak. China has invested massively in infrastructure, tunnels and roads and highways and dams and so on and so forth. And how does that then play with other players in the region? Russia, Iran, Turkey, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think so. So Xinjiang, there's no denying now it's becoming, one of the biggest human rights tragedies in the world right now. As you mentioned, we already had a situation where the Uyghur Muslim, once majority, are becoming a minority there. But now the latest travesty is that we've got upwards of perhaps 1 million people out of a population of 13 million that are in what they call re-education camps. You've got cases where parents are being taken away because they practice Islam when they're not supposed to, and children are being put in orphanages. You've also got this alarming sort of test trial. Hopefully it's not a test trial. Hopefully it won't go expand, but effort of this sort of big brother technology-based monitoring system that's happening, particularly now in Xinjiang, and starting to happen elsewhere in China, which is based on everything from voice recognition, facial recognition, DNA and blood sampling, and a vast social credit system where you basically get punished for doing things that they think of that are deemed to be socially wrong, which includes perhaps growing a beard if you're a Muslim. This is really there's been problems there forever. I've made multiple visits to Xinjiang. It's really been awful to see what's happened in the last few years in terms of these re-education camps. So tying it into the rest of the region, first of all, there has been a problem with internal, call it what you will, terrorism, independence movement within Xinjiang, and there have been bombs that have gone off over the years in different cities in Xinjiang and elsewhere in China that were specific, now is clear, were set off by Uyghur Muslims who were chafing against these controls in Xinjiang. Some of that, there has been some spillover apparently from Afghanistan. There's been some Uyghurs that have fought with ISIS in Syria, as a fact. And so the border has become a real concern from the Chinese government's perspective because there has been some people coming across the border that specifically are coming to try to foment unrest in Xinjiang. I would say that the response, I think, it's been dramatic to see how things have gotten so ugly and unpleasant, and I think there's sort of a chicken and an egg thing. I think what they're doing, what I think the government is doing right now in Xinjiang is setting the seeds for a much, much more violent future because of the way they're treating a lot of very innocent people, innocent Muslim people there. So they've tried, so oil and gas pipelines, they've tried to connect it to the rest of the region. They try to connect it into China. I was out watching the construction of a gas pipeline that went from the desert in Xinjiang to Shanghai to bring natural gas in, which is part of trying to develop that part of China. Now a lot of them, as you say, are extending into Central Asia. We've seen some attacks on Chinese embassies in some of the neighboring Central Asia provinces, which were probably related to this, what's happening within Xinjiang. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there. But it's extremely disturbing and a real tragedy. It has geopolitical elements to it as well.
So I apologize for having to be the time police here, but we've got another wonderful presentation coming up right after this. I want to thank everybody who took the time this morning to come out. I want to thank Dexter Roberts for his outstanding presentation, and once again the Central Asian Studies, Southwest Asian Studies Conference for making this possible for all of you to be here today. So thank you so very much, and I hope you gained a lot of insight and knowledge.
Thanks. A lot of very interesting to talk.